Welcome to Artificiality, where minds meet machines. We founded Artificiality to help people make sense of artificial intelligence. Every week, we publish essays, podcasts, and research to help you be smarter about AI. Please check out all of Artificiality at www.artificiality.world. We're excited to welcome to the podcast Jonathan Feinstein, professor at the Yale School of Management and author of Creativity in Large-Scale Contexts, Guiding Creative Engagement and Exploration. Our interest in creativity is broader than the context of the creative professions like art, design, and music. We see creativity as the foundation of how we move ahead as a species, including our culture, science, and innovation. We're interested in the huge combinatorial space of creativity, linked together by complex networks. And that interest led us to Jonathan. Through his research and interviews with a wide range of creative individuals, from artists and writers to scientists and entrepreneurs, Jonathan has developed a framework for understanding the creative process as an unfolding journey over time. He introduces key concepts such as guiding conceptions, guiding principles, and the notion of finding golden seeds amidst the vast landscape of information and experiences that shape our creative context. By looking at creativity mathematically, Jonathan has exposed the tremendous beauty of the creative process as being intuitive, exploratory, and supported by math and machines and knowledge and structure. He shows how creativity is much broader and more interesting than the stereotypical idea of creativity as simply a singular light bulb moment. In our conversation, we explore some of the most surprising and counterintuitive findings from Jonathan's work, how his ideas challenge conventional wisdom about creativity, and the implications for individuals and organizations seeking to innovate in an increasingly AI-driven world. Let's dive into our conversation with Jonathan Feinstein. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to talk to you.
Thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast.
So let's start off with a key question. What was the inspiration for writing this book? And tell us a bit about what are some of the most surprising or counterintuitive findings from your research, and how might they challenge conventional wisdom about creativity?
Yes, thank you. I think that I take a very different approach to creativity than has typically been taken. Most work in creativity tends to look at a very short-term perspective on how creativity happens. If you look on Google Images, it is still true today that one of the most common images for the word creativity is the light bulb. Another common image would be the lightning bolt from an earlier time. That is, there's a sense that creativity just suddenly strikes out of the blue, and also a sense that there's certain people who we think of as geniuses who can create, and all the rest of us are left struggling to be creative, if at all. So that's a typical view, and from my very beginning when I got into thinking about creativity, I have always thought about it as a longer-term process, what I think of as an unfolding process over time. I think some of that is rooted in my love of biographies, which I've enjoyed and read since I was a child. Some of it, I think, is coming from a different discipline, which is economics and social science modeling. And some of it is coming from as I began to get into working on creativity and started to interview a lot of people about the way they actually go about their creative work. I quickly learned that it's very much of a life story that's unfolding over time. And if you want to understand how someone comes to have great creative ideas and contributions, you really have to view it in that longer term perspective. That doesn't mean that the brilliant moments don't happen. They do happen based on many, many accounts from many people, ranging from Albert Einstein to great artists to lots of individuals we could talk about. But you really have to see those moments as set within a much longer term context, things that happen that set people up, that enable them to eventually have those ideas emerge. And I think that relates also to how I eventually took the perspective in this book, which is that, well, what's happening over that longer term process? If an idea is just something that suddenly occurs to you, but it took you 3 years or 5 years or longer to have the idea, what happened? What happened over those periods of time? Really, it's because the world we live in, our context is very rich and very large scale. We have so many experiences. We know so much. And today with the internet, with the rise of AI, there's just more and more information all the time around us. And really the challenge is, how do I identify a good idea, a promising idea, out of the myriad of possibilities that we could potentially think about pursuing? Because, of course, when you actually pursue a creative idea, like write a story for a book, that's going to be a lot of work. So it's really important that you have a good idea to hit upon that you could pursue. So as I thought about it, I realized really the key, you have to kind of flip things around from the way it's often thought of. Often we think, oh, I have no ideas. I'm like a blank slate. But really, it's sort of the opposite issue. There's too much around us. And the real problem is, how do you find something good, something you believe in that you can pursue that has promise? So that's the large-scale nature of the context of creativity. And as I began to pursue that and looked at people doing creative work, Virginia Woolf, who actually wrote a story about this, Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, lots of other people, the key really is having some sense of guidance, having some conception, where do I want to look? What in general do I want to start thinking about as building blocks that I could put together? Not the details, which are way too complicated and just so many details that you get lost, but a bigger picture sense, what's my vision? Or as I think about it, what's my guiding conception? And what that's doing is it's locating a region within this very rich context where I can focus my creative attention. So in some sense, that's where this book started, but there's also a personal story I wanted to share about how it started for, I think, listeners who are interested. I've been working on creativity for a while, and in my first book, I did interview a lot of people. My first book is called The Nature of Creative Development, also published by Stanford Business Books, and interviewed those people and saw that they were reaching to find creativity over a longer journey, but I really didn't have as good a sense for how to model it. And from the beginning, for me, modeling has been very important. I really would like a mathematical structure so we can more precisely talk about what is actually happening. Well, I was struggling a bit a few years ago with these ideas of guiding conceptions, and actually around that time, our father passed away. My brother and I have had sort of a fraught relationship over many decades. We weren't always the best of friends growing up. We had periods when we were. We had many years when we really didn't talk at all. After my father passed away, for whatever reason, my brother David and I started to talk more regularly. I visited him. He lives out in Portland. He came back and visited out here in New Haven. And we were sort of getting back reacquainted, I guess. My brother's in applied math and physics, and he was working on a mathematical model on some very different topic. But talking to him, seeing the passion he had for that, inspired me to realize, wow, I have these ideas of guiding conceptions, but I need to put that together with the mathematical structure in order to make progress with really working out these ideas. And I'd known earlier that the best way to model context is as a kind of network, because there's networks of concepts that we live in, networks of experiences, networks of people. But I really hadn't quite pushed it. And after talking to him, I thought, wow, this is where I have to go. So I think the origins, the genesis of this book was really at that point where I said, here's a network structure. I started with a very simple one that I can work with to actually begin to put some structure around what I mean by guiding conception and how a person can develop that into a full creative project.
I think this book is quite remarkable because what it does is really bring home what this idea of large-scale context is. It's about living a whole life story. It's about the fact that the world has sort of infinite context for us to learn from. And as you say, how do you narrow things down and find these good ideas, the things you really want to develop more, or understand why you had an aha moment, right? There seems to be both of those things playing. One One of the things that I think would be really helpful for listeners to understand up front before we dive into the sort of structure of creativity that you have essentially kind of discovered here is carrying on from talking about the work that your brother's done and the math that he brings to it. How do you see the relationship between the work you've done and complexity science, machine learning, and network science, just to give us a sense of how cross-disciplinary this is? And also, I guess part of the angle of my question is to help people feel that it's actually fine to feel good about applying math to something that feels as human and sort of magical as creativity, because it is something that's explorable and discoverable using mathematical networks and modeling. And that doesn't diminish the creativity. It actually makes it more creative in my mind. But for some people, there's the sense that there's a mystique around creativity. We should sort of leave it alone to sort of be something that is not discoverable by machines. And I'm interested in how you see these fields together and how they play as being creative in themselves.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I'd like to think we're at a point of turning, of change in the way we think about creativity and the way we research it and the way we begin to understand it. I think some of that does have to do with AI and all the stuff going on in the computational world. And I think it is about understanding we can build models. They have to be at a sufficient level of complexity and richness to really capture the challenges of creativity. And I think up till a couple of decades ago, that may not have been possible, but today it is possible. Now, I should say about that also, there's a mystique around creativity. There's also a mystique around AI today. And I just finished teaching my class on creativity and innovation here at Yale. And students, of course, use AI to create, and we talk about that. But most people don't really know much about the models, the underlying mathematical structure. I'm sure some of the visitors on your podcast do. But because they don't, there might be a tendency to think, wow, that's going to crowd out human creativity. We're not going to be left having the possibility to be our own independent creators. At least where things stand right now, I don't believe that's true. I think that it's interesting. I work with networks to model human creativity, and the AI world is also built around networks, neural networks. So in that sense, there's a comparability, and the idea of large scale would definitely apply in both worlds. Those networks are constructed very differently, by design. They're really not constructed primarily from the point of view of creativity. They're constructed for prediction, for case analysis, for correct categorization, things like that, translation. And so they have their own structure. And I think it turns out where we are right now, that structure is probably quite different than the structures in the human mind that would be most important for creative work. So that we're kind of left, really, it's very different. Another thought, I have two thoughts about that I can share, and then we can continue. I'm not an expert. I want to say I'm learning as I go with the AI. I've noticed with my students that they might take an idea and then go to AI to sort of turn it into a picture, let's say like a logo for a company idea. And in some ways, it so quickly turns it into like a glossy photo, if you will, that then their creativity a bit gets shut down. So I think a lot of this it's a tool. And rather than being threatened, let's learn how we most effectively use it as a tool with our own creativity. To me, I think some of that it's really important to do some creative work ahead of time before you ever touch an AI machine so that you have some thought of where you're going. But then at the same time, when you have these more general ideas in your head, a guiding conception or a partially formed idea, you have to be very careful that someone else, whether it's a computer or for that matter, another person, doesn't over-determine it too quickly in such a way that you're no longer in touch with the more general open possibilities that were there, earlier for you. So you really want to use it in a way that helps you explore the possibilities, but not in a way that tends to trap you to where you begin to feel like you're sort of, this is where I am, and I could have gone some other ways, but it seems like it's hard to do that now. which by the way relates to a related topic about just creativity and people in the world wanting to be creative. I think it's often the case that people, the first idea is kind of set in stone. It's like, I have my idea, I'm done. When we look at creative people engaged in creative work who really pursue it and to a high level of their own personal contribution, that's not how it works. There's a lot of revision. There's a lot of development over time. And so I think it's about learning how to use the new tools in a way that's going to also further us in that journey.
So I want to get to the kind of meat of the story around the way that you've exposed some of these common patterns. And this is a place where I would strongly encourage people to go out and buy the book because it's actually really helpful to have some of these definitions.
And to have the visualizations.
Have the visualizations, because you in the book you put things down to small scale networks so that you can develop a bit more intuition around it. So if I can sort of describe a couple of things that jumped out to me, and it will be clear the bits that I still haven't completely understood well enough, and we can sort of explain from there. So this idea of a guiding conception, I think of that as being quite broad, quite intuitive, something that's really flexible and changes, and you learn. It's your learning conception in many ways, that it guides you to say, there are two parts of my creative network, if you like, my knowledge, my lived experience, the people around me. Those seem to be something that is very much part of what guides your intuition. It says, here's two really interesting places for me to go, and then there's something that sits beneath those two. And that's where this idea of finding what you call a golden seed is. And then as you explore more, and as you then sort of go backwards and forth between the other idea of a guiding principle, which seems intuitively to me to be something that allows you to actually remove ideas. It's almost a sorting mechanism. So if my guiding conception is interestingness, I'm just going to pick that because I just follow my nose in terms of what's interesting, and what's interesting changes over my life, changes week by week. But I follow that interestingness and then find a couple of things that actually really aren't all that related. They sit beneath what you call parents, and those parents have to sit beneath separate parents. So it could be an idea from artificial intelligence and neuroscience, say. Those are different kinds of parents. But then I use the guiding principle to sort of remove some of the noise and the mess, and that might be some sort of level of parsimony, or it could just be, that's too technical. I'm removing anything that feels too technical for me. And then I get to a place where I can add one more thing. And I have to push myself as far out in my network as I can for that one more thing. But then there's this interesting caveat to that, which is as you trace back through the steps in the network, you're looking for a minimum path. You're looking for the minimum number of steps back to those original parents. Now, I might have to, do a little hand sketch in the show notes or something to sort of describe that. But did I get that even vaguely right? Can you walk me through what you're really trying to say? And because I've used that process, and hey, it actually kind of works. But I'd be really interested to see whether I've adopted it in any way without messing it up.
Honestly, I think you've done a beautiful job of describing a lot of the ideas in the book. I love that phrase, learning conception, which is also how I think about it. And I definitely think it's about trying out things, and then the guiding principles are coming along to help you kind of winnow out and find the ones that are most promising. I think of guiding conceptions and guiding principles as like two pincers in a way that come together. They're both essential to the process, and they work in tandem. They work a little bit in sequence. Let me give you one example. Maybe that'd be a way to understand this. Virginia Woolf is in the book. One reason why Virginia Woolf is a great person to study, in addition to being a great writer, is that she left us so much material that we understand more about her creative process than maybe we would for some other people. And she wrote a short story called The Mark on the Wall. And in the middle of that story, she writes a paragraph that essentially articulates a guiding conception for herself. And she says, I'm going to paraphrase now. We could read it exactly if you'd like, because I have my book here and you do as well. But roughly, she says, we're going to develop a literature based on reflections. So when we look at other people, we look in their eyes, they're looking at us. We see these reflections of ourselves in the way they're thinking about us and the way that we're thinking about them. And I want to develop, she really says, novelists in the future will focus more and more on these reflections, and they're going to leave descriptions of reality out. And she compares that and says, that's kind of what Shakespeare did. That's what the ancient Greeks did. And so her notion is, I want a literature. She really was trying to go against the earlier literature from the Victorian era, which was really her father's time period, and her relationship with her father was complicated and definitely relevant. And she said, I don't want to do that. I want to find a literature where I don't have to deal with all that hard, sticky description. So I found this other way to do it. It's kind of like ice skating, where it's just going to be reflections. And that was a guiding conception. And then over the next roughly 2.5 years, she wrote a series of short stories that I think you can understand as her exploring that guiding conception, trying to find a way to realize that guiding conception in a form of literature that would work for her, which I think could be frustrating. And she had her own guiding principles around what good writing would be and so forth that she was using. And she tried many things, people writing letters to each other, someone who literally finds rocks on a beach that are shiny glass, all kinds of things. Eventually, 2.5 years later, she wrote a short story called An Unwritten Novel. It's got kind of a funny name. But in writing that story, she hit upon a form that could realize the guiding conception. And so she actually has a famous diary entry right after she completed that story where she says, I've hit upon a form that's going to work for me. And she says, this time I imagine there'll be no scaffolding, scarcely a brick to be seen. That is, there's not going to be any of this description of reality. It's just going to be one thing unfolding out of another, very fast-paced movement of a story. And after she did that and had hit upon really a way to execute it, if you will, that's when she entered her great modernist period. She immediately started work on what became Jacob's Room. Then she wrote Mrs. Dalloway, and then she wrote her masterpiece To the Lighthouse, all within about 5 years. So she followed the process very much. If I give another example, and then we can continue with questions, Steve Jobs is an interesting figure also in the book. And he, whatever their guiding conceptions might have been for certain products like the iPod or the iPhone, he had very strong guiding principles. Could kind of think of those as being like design principles, simplicity, elegance. He liked a sense of playfulness. And he had it very strongly intuitively understood, such that when his design teams would come to him with designs, he would just constantly be knocking them down and saying, no, that's not it. You got to go back and try again. I want to change the curvature here. It's just little things that aren't quite what I want. He was very, very strict with his application of his guiding principles. But to follow that thought, guiding principles, which come up later in the process after you already have your conception and you're working on your little seed ideas, they're also creative. And Steve Jobs, one of the stories that's told is that they were working on a product, and he went to the Stanford Shopping Center, and he went into a department store, and he saw Cuisinart. And he loved the curving of the base of that Cuisinart, and he bought one, and he brought it back to his team. And he said, look, this is the way I want this product to look. See that curvature there? That's what I want to achieve. So the creative link he made there all the way out to this other design project is very interesting. He did that with a lot of things. Zen Buddhism, he's famous for also being very attracted to those principles. So there's both the winnowing down And there's also the creativity, as you say, to find that remote element that's going to make this project work.
I'm going to hand to Dave now because this is like his favorite part.
Well, I worked at Apple 20 plus years ago and was lucky enough to spend a decent amount of time with Steve and witnessed that. You're right. The guiding principle was really quite important. There's the exactness.
And hard to live under.
Yeah, it was. There's the exactness of it. There was one of the leads of one of my software products, the lead engineer who for years talked about writing a book about working with Steve, and the title was going to be One Pixel to the Left. Because we'd go in for software reviews, and literally that was one of the comments once on one of these applications. That button needs to be one pixel to the left, and you just sort of scratch your head. But there's something interesting you said about this sort of finding something unexpected. Sort of that third idea that's sort of at the edge of the network that would make something different. There was a period of time when we were working on GarageBand early on that we hatched the idea of like, well, we were in the midst of, all these new devices and all these new things that would plug in, right? Because this was the iPod era and just after that. And the idea, the question came up was, should we have a keyboard? And not a typing keyboard, but an actual musical keyboard. And went through the whole early process with all the, sort of the new designs and spec'd it up and walked into to sit with Johnny and sort of think about it. And I think what you've tapped into is exactly why we passed on it. There was no sort of Cuisinart moment that would make it just different enough. It just felt like there wasn't anything new that we could bring to the table. It would be beautiful, be elegant, it would work really well, et cetera, but so many other keyboard makers already did that. There was no reason to do anything really different because there was no third element from out there. I'm reaching with my hands, to the edge of the network to do something different. I think that's fascinating.
And that third element just seems so open and exciting to try and push the boundaries on how you would even find it. It's one thing to go for a walk in a department store and expect to see something versus not expect to see something. It's like, how do you know your mind is open enough to even notice? It's almost a bit of luck at that point, but being open and curious to grab it or know when it's actually even relevant. What did because there's so many different kind of cases here, art and writing and science. Was there anything common there, or is it just about the particular, because it's across someone's lifespan, that even changes significantly? How people go on, how that third element is discovered. It seems very peripatetic, beautiful, like quite a beautiful moment to even find those things. And this is where I get positive about AI and creativity, because I actually think that AI can take us much further into other places than we would ever go before, if we have those tools available to us.
Thank you. Those are very interesting comments and ways of thinking about what I'm doing in the book. And thank you for the comments, Dave, about Apple and Steve Jobs. Let me give you another example about the guiding principles to make a slightly different related point. Also in the book, Albert Einstein. And for Albert Einstein, if you read there, the principle of relativity was absolutely at the center of his creative work. And if you asked what was so special about that principle in the way he used it, I would say he was very strict in his application of the principle of relativity to a degree to which other people might put forward certain solutions or ideas for physics situations, and he would not be satisfied with them because he did not think that they fit with his understanding of what that principle of relativity actually implied, which I think has a certain resonance with Steve Jobs, who also was very strict in applying those principles. So if you thought about that from the point of view of a company or a team of people working or using AI for that matter, I would say it's important to try to articulate your guiding principles and understand your level of commitment to certain guiding principles, because Einstein's commitment to that principle was supreme. And if you look at he had several great creative moments, as he describes it in his autobiographical notes, which is a very interesting document to read. But the second one, which is maybe most relevant here, after he had developed the special relativity theory, and he was kind of struggling, how do I incorporate gravity into this system that I'm working on? How does relativity, what does it say about being in a gravitational field versus not being in one? And I think he wrestled with it. According to him, he was sitting in his office one day and looking out the window. So that's what he was doing. And he's looking out the window. And according to the lore, there was someone painting on a ladder outside the window. And the thought occurred to him, well, what if the painter fell off the ladder and was just in free fall in the gravitational field? And he suddenly realized, according to what he said, wow, if you're in free fall, of course you're not going to feel the force on you because you're in free fall. And so somehow there's a correspondence between being in free fall in a gravitational field versus just being in open space without any forces at all on you, just hanging there. And then there's also a correspondence between being stuck somewhere in a gravitational field where that force is coming down on you versus actually accelerating in open space where the acceleration also puts that force on you. So that's the equivalence he made. And I think you'd have to say he was very creative in making that step. I think most people would say that was a very creative moment. What did it come out of? It come out of years and years of focusing on the problem and a very strict adherence to what relativity meant, so that when he had that thought, he could see the implication in relation to that principle. So to me, I would say articulate your principles and understand the levels of commitment you have to different principles, and that might help you as a team, as an organization, develop things that are more consistent with the principles.
I remember working with someone years ago who I think had an intuition for this. And he put himself in the role of being the guardian of the guiding principle. He recognized that in the broader context of the kind of disruptive product that they were trying to develop, that the principles would just get watered down at every step because it was just so difficult. It was just so hard because it would always, we need to change this, we need to change that. And he always described his role in the team as not being the boss or not being the resource holder. He was the one who just sat there in every single meeting and said, is this going to make it simple for the customer, yes or no? And he held that on behalf of the whole team. They wouldn't have got there otherwise because it was just too easy to kind of chip away at that core principle. So I wonder if that's one of the things that organizations can do is have more sensitivity to just how hard some of this creativity might be to enact, and give someone that role and allow them to have that role and respect them for having that role.
Yeah, one of the things I like about the model I've developed so far is it has these creativities at different phases in the process, right? The guiding conception can be very creative. Virginia Woolf's was for sure. Many of the other examples in the book, I think, also would be like artists or scientists. But then at the same time, as you've highlighted, as you begin to develop, the guiding conception can spawn a seed idea, but as you begin to develop it, there's many steps along the way that also call for a lot of creativity. And so it unpacks it a little bit so we can understand that it is a longer-term process with many creative moments along the way. Kind of brings us back to where we started this interview, where I talked about how it's a longer-term unfolding process. That's true for the life person over the whole journey of life, but it's also true within a more complex creative project. In my class a couple of weeks ago, we read actually about 3 organizations and then had students discuss those as well as their own experiences. One was Steve Jobs at Apple. One was this wonderful article that Ed Catmull wrote about how Pixar fosters collaborative creativity. And the third was a couple of videos about SpaceX, one a short clip from Elon Musk, and one a longer interview or speech by Gwynne Shotwell, who's the president and chief operating officer. And I think that what came out of that is, in all cases, they're managing projects that there are many creative steps along the way. I think Catmull talked about how there are thousands of ideas in a Pixar movie. Every one of them counts into the overall whole that gets created. Obviously, SpaceX, if you're building a rocket ship, there's a lot that goes on, a lot of need to solve problems creatively. And Shotwell talked about how they get ideas from anybody. Summer interns could contribute ideas to how to solve problems. One of my students in class said that there's a YouTube. At one point, Elon Musk got an answer to a question from a YouTube comment, actually, which was interesting. But to carry on that discussion about your story and how do organizations learn, after talking about those three organizations, all of which are good at innovation or have been at many times, students were talking about their own experiences, sometimes working in smaller organizations. Some of them are entrepreneurs, working for some different industries. And if you asked me what's, the biggest difference with organizations that are struggling more, I think it's that they don't consciously articulate and sort of self-understand or reflect what is our process for creativity and innovation. They don't have it articulated. They don't quite understand in a consistent way the steps they'll go through, how the different people will contribute, and some understanding of the structure that they can put around this process, especially a longer-term process where you'll need that. So then you're left with organizations where there could be some super creative people, and I've worked with organizations where they clearly are. But if you don't have the structure, each person is off on their own, generating their own ideas. They could be great ideas, but they may or may not fit with other people's ideas. If the process is very different every time, it becomes very inefficient. You might lose ideas. We've talked about how you have those third elements that you have to keep adding in to get to something great. You just might not ever get there. So I would say a key step for an organization is to reflect, to become more conscious and deliberate, and understand the process that they're dealing with.
Do you have recommendations for organizations to think about when they have a guiding principle that's strong enough? And also I'm thinking on the third element, how to evaluate whether that third element is just too wacky of something to integrate into the process. Like it's definitely an experience you can easily have with generative AI. You can actually mash up some things and you look at it and go, well, that's really silly, but this sort of, there's an intuition that I think some people can have to say that guiding principle is really strong enough to really drive where we're going, and can look at a third element and go, yeah, that might actually really work. But then plenty of people don't have that intuition. And so I'm wondering if you have guidance to help think about what that might be, how they could approach that.
It's interesting. And, being a professor who studies creative people in all walks of life and across fields, and as compared with organizations out in the for-profit world, or really any part of the world where there's a lot of time pressure often to complete things, the first thing I would say is that there's a sense of extreme commitment to guiding principles that you see with someone like Albert Einstein that is probably unusual out in the world at large. And what it led to was a case where it would take him 10 years to work out an idea. So his original special relativity theory, from a paradox he hit upon at the age of 16 to actually work it out, was about 10 years, even though the final moment of working it out, according to him, happened in a conversation with his best friend. That was when he sort of had the insight. But it took 10 years because I think he rejected a lot of proposals along the way that he didn't think were going to work. So I think some of that is, interestingly, not that somebody wouldn't have a sense for it, but that there might be pressures in the organization not to support somebody or a team in really adhering to the guiding principles. So I would look at that side of things probably more. But I would say as well that within an organizational context or a team, some people might intuitively pick up on that better. And then you want to be able to listen to those people. Just like with any other creative process, different people contribute different parts to the process. Somebody who's a visionary with the guiding conception, they might or might not be the person with the most strictly adhered guiding principle to actually make that work, right? And you could argue that Steve Jobs, the guiding principle was really his forte, right? He really understood how to make it work. But there might be a lot of other people involved in generating ideas that could then be developed. So you want to distribute I think, what's happening. And that's also part of good management, right? To understand how different people will contribute to the overall effort.
Well, that speaks to a point that you made in the book, that I wonder if there's have you seen that there's a way to sort of structure that innovation process? And what I'm getting at here is that you say guiding conceptions are individualistic and highly creative, sort of says, kind of leave that alone enough to have full exploration, to be information maximizing, to have high risk, and not try and be efficient, not try and put any efficiency metrics on that, versus guiding principles are more likely to be accepted by a larger community in a field. So that sort of speaks to this idea that it's almost sort of going back to some of the earlier creativity work, where creativity has to be sort of measured by the culture that it sits in. It has to be validated by, say, the scientific community or an artistic community to be recognized as truly creative. But having the process be really strongly focused on those guiding principles, having connection to the rest of the organization, so that it somehow fits capabilities, or at least it breaks capabilities in some conscious, logical way, because you're going to go and do something completely new. But that the core of that collective process is in applying and being disciplined about applying the guiding principles. Is that a way to think about that, or what's the downside of thinking about it that way?
I like what you said. In general, I think take it in a slightly different direction. I would go back to guiding conceptions. Something else I've done with organizations and teams is I like to have them do an exercise where, as an individual or sometimes as a small team, they articulate a guiding conception or more than one guiding conception that they might be interested in pursuing. And the reason I say that is that in articulating a guiding conception, very much like you said, you really want to let go of constraints. You want to let yourself fly a little more freely and say, what is something great that we imagine would be a wonderful product area or type of story or movie that we would love to explore, because we see ways that the context again has different layers, right? And the guiding conceptions tend to sit a little higher in the context, involving slightly more general concepts as parents, as you call them. Let's think at that level about areas of combination without putting pressure on ourselves that right this minute we have to say what the idea or what the big project is going to be that's going to fit with the guided conception. I say that because I think one of the areas that we see with creativity is that people are a little unsure, anxious. They want to get to the idea right away, and so they might not give themselves the freedom to sort of articulate a guided conception in this sort of broader, more imaginative way. And what that does is it shut down the wilder, the more creative options before they even get started. So I do think that in a way the two parts are separate. And I love the idea of a separate workshop or privileged time to articulate guiding conceptions. And then as you begin to work with that and generate seeds, you might revise it. As it collides with the guiding principles and they're working together, things might get modified and changed. But to be your best with creativity, you want both parts of that overall picture to be working well and working together.
And just so that it's a little bit clearer in my mind as well, how do you describe that difference between the golden seed and the golden project? And where are the places in the book in your research that you've gone, wow, this really explains that difference really well?
Well, there's a couple of examples in the book we haven't talked about, so this is a good time maybe to mention them. Scientist Hans Krebs is in the book. We know a lot about him because there was a wonderful biography written about him, also based on extensive interviews with him. And he is somebody who developed a guiding conception to take some experimental methods, laboratory methods he had learned in a different context and apply them to a new field, emerging field of biochemistry. It was a beautiful guiding conception. When he got out and started his own lab, he immediately took on a seed project. Actually, his first project was the synthesis of urea, and he was trying to figure out what is the process behind the synthesis of urea, kind of the final step in the metabolic chain of reactions. And he tried lots of things. He was puzzled for a long time. And so it wasn't like the guiding conception seed. If you think of that as a quote golden seed, as in that was one that had potential to maybe lead to a scientific discovery. But for quite a while, he was running experiments and really didn't come up with anything. So the seed could have potential, but until you find the additional element or elements, you're not going to really see what that potential is. And much later, he suddenly discovered that a particular enzyme, arginine, was key in sort of showing how this reaction might be working and how urea was actually being synthesized. And he got this puzzle. So that was some months into the project. So there really were several creative steps. And then as he went and solved that puzzle with kind of a eureka moment of realizing, wow, this is a cycle. There's this interesting catalytic cycle. That was, if you will, the golden project where he said, wow, I've actually nailed this down. This is how this process works. So I would say it's a case where the golden seed was early and the golden project was later. Just, I won't go into as much detail, but also in the book is indigenous artist Clifford Possum. And he also had a guiding conception that was very powerful that really was going to change the way indigenous Australian art was done. And he started doing a painting, but there was just something that wasn't quite working. And he also had some pretty strong aesthetic guiding principles around what he wanted his art to be. And even though he had the painting, the guiding conception, which was creative, wasn't all working. And at that later stage, his guiding principles kicked in, and he was able to add elements to the painting to make it all work in the way that he wanted.
In terms of providing, in terms of practical advice for people who are really interested in creativity and innovation, but don't have access to some of the mathematical tools. We work a lot with metaphor. We help people be more creative by analogical and metaphorical reasoning, which has its limits. It's really powerful. It's exciting. People enjoy it, but it has natural limits. There is a quote that you say in the book, which I think is just so something that really resonates with me, and because every time I do this, I find something new. As I've discovered developing these visualizations in the course of developing a visual mapping, one perceives connections and patterns of connection that one was not aware of previously. And it sounds like so simple to just sit down and map out, I don't know, a group of people, your ideas, your life's the creativity you feel at that moment. People often don't do it. But every time you do it, there's always an aha in there that I've experienced. I've seen many teams I never thought about it that way. Or I knew that person was important, but I never saw that relationship clashed with that or was different. And is that how far can you take that? How far can you push literally a whiteboard to create that connectivity and that mapping? Have you seen it fail? Does it? What's the limits on making it useful?
That's a very interesting question, and I would agree that most people, when we talk about this, they're not used to thinking about their rich context of life, if you will, as a network. We're kind of all familiar with the idea of a social network, although even then, as you say, putting yourself in a social network is not necessarily something that most people have done. They might think about their family and a few people, but they might not really have thought about the scale of it. And this is all about scale. What I have found is when I present these networks to people, honestly, they can be confused until they begin to really take it apart. It takes time. It's a new language, if you will. And if you're not used to the language, it takes time to understand the building blocks of the language and how they fit together. So my thought about that would be, if you want to do this, don't think you're going to do it in the next 20 minutes. You can go to my book and see some examples of these contexts that, by the way, I had a graphic designer in the UK. We spent a lot of time developing these figures to really visualize what's happening. And I think they are kind of the high point of the book, or one of the high points, I think. But I think if you go look at that and then you start thinking about, let's map out our context, my own or our company's context, think of it as an exercise that you can work on over a period of time, and you're going to gradually build your muscles, if you will, and begin to see things in this visual language. And then as you begin to do that, you're going to start to realize the power of just seeing how things at different edges of the network interconnect. So I think Dave had talked about, or you both had talked about, the length of the paths, right? And I think that's something where as you build the scale out a little bit more, you start to be able to measure that and see, well, there are some things out there that maybe I haven't thought about them in relation to something on this other part of my network, but maybe now's the time. It fits with the general point that it's helpful for most people to help them think more laterally, to think from the point of view of a guiding conception about broader domains and topics they're going to bring together. They might not automatically do that. If you're a manager in a company somewhere, that might not really be what you're tasked to do most of the time. So the visuals are a wonderful way to get your brain charged and moving in that direction. I should say that as we move into the world of AI, the networks are really, really big. We probably can't do that. But in a way that's going to make it more important for humans who want to interface better with that world to begin to develop a facility with this language. And I think it will help them understand how to interface with those tools more effectively.
Well, you just articulated a core intuition I have that I hadn't actually landed, which is, it's sort of like this is the basis of rethinking design thinking. It's a much more complexity, AI, network science way of thinking about how to find those ideas that make sense to invest more to explore.
Actually, I should say as well, I loved your phrase earlier, the learning conception, and the work I'm starting to do right now, and we'll see if it leads eventually to a third book, which I would love, is about how people build up their context over time, right? So having conceptions and then going out and learning, having experiences, building new connections with those new elements and old elements and new insights, and over time the context builds up. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic process to think about modeling, but it's all about using the powerful computational tools available to us now and being able to explore that in a way that I don't think in these fields in the past it really was explored.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fascinating
privilege.
Conversation, a huge privilege. Your book has really reframed a way to think about creativity for me that I wasn't really expecting, to be honest. And I love the way that you started at the beginning, that, everybody thinks it's a light bulb or a stroke of lightning, and then actually bringing this concept of networks to it to actually explain it in a different way is really mind-opening for me. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you both for inviting me. You had incredible questions and insights, I might add. So I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope listeners will also enjoy it.